All right, good. So good afternoon to all. Early afternoon for us and later afternoon in Rio. So we're going to go ahead and get started. My name's Kevin Funk. I'm a faculty member here at Columbia in the Committee on Global Thought, also in the Department of Political Science and the Institute of Latin American Studies. And I'm the director of the Committee on Global Thought's Lunchtime Seminar Series. Wonderful to see you on a Friday afternoon and a pleasure to welcome you to our third and final lunchtime seminar of the fall semester, fall for us at least. So as many of you know, the CGT functions as an interdisciplinary space in which global parallels and connections, including between seemingly disparate lines of inquiry and places, are explored and examined with the aim of making a difference in thinking and acting in the world today. To this end, the CGT hosts numerous initiatives and events, including this lunchtime seminar series. Which provide a forum for faculty to discuss current research assessing issues of global importance with the Columbia community and beyond. And in that vein, we will indeed ensure that we have significant time for questions and conversations during the second half of today's event. So today we have the distinct privilege to be joined by Maurício Santoro, who's an assistant professor in the Department of International Relations at the State University of Rio de Janeiro. Previously, he was a visiting researcher at the New School and the Universidad Torquato di Tella in Buenos Aires, and also worked for Amnesty International as a reporter for the Global newspaper and at Brazil's Ministry of Industry and Foreign Trade. He's the author of Brazil-China Relations in the 21st Century, The Making of a Strategic Partnership, which was released earlier this year, and has been kept very, very busy due to interview requests by both Brazilian and international media on Sino-Brazilian relations, but also Brazilian politics and foreign policy more generally. And there has indeed been a lot for him to discuss as of late, of course. In this new book, Maurício explores the political, economic, and environmental implications of the booming bilateral relationship between the two countries. He tells the story of how China has become Brazil's largest trading partner, a major importer of Brazilian commodities and exporter of manufactured goods, and also a significant source of investment for Brazil. As he argues, the impacts of this booming relationship have been profound, including in regard to Brazil's social structure, its agribusiness industry, climate change diplomacy, and its relationship with the United States. And I should say as well that, of course, with the impending end of the Bolsonaro presidency and the return of Lula, this is a particularly interesting moment for contemplating these matters and having these conversations. And so I have the pleasure of serving as both the moderator and discussant for today's conversation. Welcome again to everybody who's here with us today, and it's my pleasure to introduce and turn the floor over to Maurício.
Thank you, Kevin, for this very kind introduction. My idea is to make a very brief presentation to you, about 15 minutes, basically the outline of the book, and then we can engage in the discussions and the debates, especially about what's going on right now in Brazil with the end of the Bolsonaro administration and the victory of Lula in the presidential elections, because I mean, this is the hottest topic right now in Brazil. But then I think that the key part of the title of my book is the making of a strategic partnership. So the idea that the relationship between Brazil and China is not an ordinary diplomatic relation, but it's something very important for Brazil and China. And we're talking about a diplomatic history of 50 years. It began in the 1970s during the Brazilian military dictatorship, which was very anti-communist. But even so, the generals decided that it was a good idea to recognize the People's Republic of China, to establish a dialogue with Mao Zedong, changing the recognitions from Taiwan, as Brazil had at that time. So what explains that and how Brazil developed that relation in the last 50 years? Let me start with a story that I tell in the first page of my book. It's a conversation that I had with my father. My father was born in a small town in the Amazon. And he told me one day that when he was a child, he never dreamed, he could never imagine that one day he would have a son that speaks Chinese and researches China, because it was something completely outside his reality. And I told my father, okay, I understand you, but you also have to remember that your hometown is now a major hub for Chinese investment in Brazil, because it's a mining city in the Amazon, where the Chinese are building railways and building factories to process the iron ore extracted in the Amazon and to export that towards China. So it's a very small example about how China became very important to Brazilians these days. And it really doesn't matter if you live in Brasília, São Paulo, Rio de Janeiro, or if you live in Marabá, the Amazon town where my father was born. So how was that possible? In the 70s, when both countries recognized each other, when they began their relationship, the diplomatic relationship, the motivation of the Brazilian generals was very much political. They understood that China was a major political actor in the international scene, with the decision of the United States to get a rapprochement with China in order to contain the Soviet Union. And the Brazilian diplomats and political leaders saw China as another global South country, as another big developing country that had many points in common with Brazil, especially at the United Nations and other international fora. So the idea that, okay, Brazil and China have two very different political systems, two very different types of economies, but they have similar positions in terms of international politics, especially some views more critical of the United States, of Western Europe, of Japan. This was not something that happened just between Brazil and China. It was more or less the same approach from Brazil and India, for example, or after apartheid of Brazil and South Africa, about all the countries that would one day form the BRICS groups. But they already had more or less the same kind of international standing. But nonetheless, the military dictatorship in Brazil was very anti-communist. So, okay, it's one thing to open an embassy in Beijing, but that will be all. No more political relationship with China. That changed in the 80s. The following decade, Brazil was making a transition to a democracy. So Brazil became a democracy again, and China started its own period of opening and reform with Deng Xiaoping, the four modernizations. So it was not more Mao Zedong and the Cultural Revolution, a much more pragmatic foreign policy, and the decision to go abroad and look for international trade, foreign investment. And Brazil and China discovered in the 80s that they had lots to learn from each other. And at the time, it was when the high-level visits between both countries began. So lots of Chinese authorities came to Brazil to learn from Brazil big development projects, such as the Itaipu Dam, or the Carajás mining complex, or the Manaus export zones. They were all important for similar initiatives in China. But at the same time, Deng Xiaoping realized that Latin America could be very important to China in terms of what not to do in its economic development policy, especially how he understood that the Latin American development of the 70s, of the 60s, was paid for in a huge level of foreign debt. And that was a mistake that China should avoid. So Brazil was important both as a positive and a negative reference for China. And in the 80s, both countries also created their first big bilateral project, which was the CIBERS project, a joint program to build artificial satellites. It was a huge science and technology cooperation between global South countries that during many years was the biggest project of that kind between two developing countries. So it was an important watershed. And then we arrived at the 90s. And in 1993, Brazil and China issued a joint statement saying that the bilateral relationship between them was so important that it was a strategic partnership. It was not an ordinary diplomatic relation. And that was the first time that both countries used this expression, strategic partnership. After that, it became quite popular among their diplomatic corps, and they are now using to describe the relationship with many other countries. But what that expression means, it's so important to me that I put that on the subtitle of my book. It's actually a quite interesting expression because it says a lot and nothing at the same time. So it's not a formal treaty. It didn't create any kind of juridical obligation between the two governments. And it's a very generic expression. It basically means that Brazil and China realized that their relationship was very important in the long term. It was not just something to discuss how trade is today or tomorrow. They were thinking about the future. And they were also making a commitment that they would go on with this high-level political dialogue, despite the troubles that both countries were facing at the time. So the 1990s were a very unstable time in Brazil, with hyperinflation, with political crisis, the impeachment of a president, and China was just recovering from the Tiananmen massacre. So lots of troubles for both countries. And they understood that they needed each other. This is an important remark, and I would argue to you that it's even more important today than it was in the 90s. But okay, it was this political commitment, but not much more than that. What really made the strategic partnership a reality was the global commodity boom of the 2000s, of the early 21st century. Because during the global commodity booms, we had that hungry China that was going abroad and buying commodities from Latin America, from Africa, from Asia, and from Brazil. China was buying soybeans, iron ore, and oil. These three big products represent nowadays more or less 75% of everything that Brazil sells to the Chinese. And in 2009, just after the global financial crisis, China became Brazil's biggest trade partner, which is a position that China holds until today. Nowadays, more or less 1/3 of all Brazilian exports goes to China. So it's a huge market for Brazilian products, and it's a huge dependence from the part of Brazil. And that's something that created a situation where we can understand the strategic partnership as something that has two pillars. One of them is economic development. So trade, investment, scientific cooperation. This is one of the pillars of the partnership. The second pillar is how China and Brazil understood each other to be other partners in Global South, as big partners in the Global South, and how they need this kind of dialogue to build a world where global political power is more balanced. Or to use the technical terms of international relations, they want to build a multipolar world. And I say in my book that these pillars, they change a little bit with time. The pillar of economic development is important to every Brazilian government, no matter who is the president. But the more political pillar of this multipolar world, it depends on who is in power in Brazil. Because we had presidents who thought that no, that Brazil should go after a special relationship with the United States or with the European Union, and that the Global South was not that much important. But when the left is in power in Brazil, this idea of a multipolar world is very important for Brazilian foreign policy, as it is now that Lula became president again. And this is an important situation as well. During the global commodity boom, Lula was president of Brazil for 8 years, and after him, Dilma Rousseff, from the same political party, his successor, that was president for another 5 years. And they created a framework for the bilateral relationship when it was not just about trade, although trade was very important, but it was also the idea that Brazil and China should work together in the multilateral institutions to build groups of the Global South countries. So we had the creation of the BRICS, we had the creation of the G20 at the World Trade Organization, of the basic group, Brazil, South Africa, India, and China, in the global negotiations about climate change. So Brazil and China were working together in a huge agenda of international affairs, and usually in what I call in my book a soft criticism against the West. So what's the difference between a soft criticism and a hard one? The soft one is about diplomacy, is about politics. The hard one is about military power. So it was never a military alliance against the West, or not even a huge political alliance against the West, but it was more like this idea that we want a bigger slice of the cake. We, the global South countries, we, the developing nations. And that was very much the scenario of the 2000s. But then the global commodities boom ended, and it ended in a very harsh way for Brazil. So the last decade in Brazil was a moment of economic recession and political crisis because of another impeachment, the rise of the far right in Brazil, and we had in 2018 the election of Jair Bolsonaro. And Bolsonaro is the first president in Brazil since the 1970s that was elected president with a very strong criticism of China. A criticism that has an economic side, that the Chinese was unfair competition with the Brazilian industry. So deindustrialization is a major concern right now in Brazil. It's a big part of the national conversation. But it was also a political concern about China. Bolsonaro is very close to the military, and they were worried about Chinese investment in Brazil and about Chinese state-owned companies taking control of key infrastructure in Brazil, especially in the electrical energy sector. And it was also a vision of the international politics that it was quite close to Donald Trump, which was the most important diplomatic ally of Bolsonaro. So in the last 4 years, the Bolsonaro administration, trade and investment with China, they keep going on. They actually increased it during his administration, but the political relation was very complicated, was very tense, especially during the beginning of the pandemic, when Bolsonaro replicated in Brazil the same kind of rhetoric that Donald Trump had in the United States, calling the coronavirus the Chinese virus, claiming that it was fabricated by the Chinese government, and so on. But in the last months of the Bolsonaro administration, he kind of reached a political agreement with the Chinese, and he stopped to criticize China. He opened the 5G internet pattern in Brazil to the Chinese company Huawei, because he understood that he needed the Chinese support, because things were going very bad for him in Brazil, with economic crisis, with political crisis. So he couldn't afford the luxury of entering a political fight with Beijing. So this was very much the bilateral scenario in the last months. And Bolsonaro just lost the presidential election in Brazil, so he was not reelected, and Lula is coming back. So what can we expect now for the next 4 years? Lula will be president for the third time. I will leave that to the debate, to the question and answer with you. But what I can say to you right now is that China will be very important for Lula as a global South partner, but also that for Xi Jinping, Lula is also very important right now, because we're discussing a China that is facing a much more tense scenario with the West, with the United States, with the European Union, and a China that needs Brazil right now as much as Brazil needs China. So with that, I will stop this very brief presentation, and I'll open to the discussion, to your questions.
Yeah, great. And thank you so much for providing that overview, kind of taking us through historically the development of the relations. And that's something that certainly comes out of the book. And I'll mention in that regard too, that everybody who's part of the Columbia system has access to the book digitally through the library. And so I encourage you to check it out. So I'll plan to ask you, I'll limit myself to 2 questions, I think, and then we'll open things up for others to participate as well. So First, you've been talking about this economic question and kind of the rise of China as Brazil's largest trade partner. In the book, you use the line that China is now key to Brazil's economic welfare. And so the first question I wanted to put forth then is, what does it mean then for Brazil's largest trading partner to be in a much different place economically than was the case when Lula was first in power? And so, as you mentioned, we're not in the commodity boom period anymore. And China is growing much more slowly than was the case previously, and is also dealing with, well, its own COVID policies. And as we know from the first Lula period, right? I mean, this kind of mild redistribution agenda with Bolsa Familia, so the family cash conditional cash transfer program, right? I mean, this was facilitated by a booming Chinese economy that was kind of bringing Brazil and many other Latin American countries along with it. So what are the implications then now for Brazil and the Lula presidency in particular, given that the key trading partner is in a much different place economically than was the case 10 or 15 years ago?
This is the quick question right now, Kevin, because in the 2000s, China was growing 10% a year. And now it's going to grow perhaps a little bit less than 3%. There is even the possibility that Brazil this year is going to grow more than China, which was something unbelievable, a couple of years ago. Yes, this is a concern for many people in Brazil, but I would say that the biggest problem is not for agribusiness, but it is from the mining companies in Brazil. Why is that so? Because although China is growing less, it's buying even more Brazilian soybeans, Brazilian meat, Brazilian agricultural products. So this huge demand goes on because the Chinese now have a better standard of living, more people in the middle class, people are eating more, and most of the Brazilian agricultural exports to China, they are closely related to food. They are usually, for example, the soybeans that is going to be used as a ration for pigs in China. So if the Chinese are eating more pig, they're going to buy more soybeans from Brazil. So this is great for Brazilians. But the problem is the real estate crisis in China. What's going on with the construction companies in the country? Because it's a very complicated crisis. I don't think that it has an easy solution. It's probably something that's going to be around for many years. And it is already affecting Brazilian companies in a negative way. Because one of the products that Brazil exports to China is iron ore. And actually, in the last years, it was often the product that it was the biggest export of Brazil to China. So less buildings in China, less activity from the construction companies. What happens to the iron ore prices? They go down. And this affects Brazil in a very negative way. So the Brazil giant mining company, Vale, more than 40% of the revenues of Vale depend on the Chinese market. So if China is in an economic crisis, Vale is in an economic crisis as well. And if you look to the Brazilian stock exchange during this year, the 10 companies that had the worst performance, many of them are mining companies because of what's happening now with the Chinese market. So yes, this is going to be a problem for Lula, and especially because I don't think that there is anybody in the new government that thinks that China is going to be a magical solution for the economic problems of Brazil. But I still am not sure if they understood how serious the situation is in China right now. Because of the real estate crisis, because of the COVID-0 policy, and how that affects Brazil. I think that in many cases, Brazilian political leaders are still thinking about the China of 15 years ago, of 20 years ago, of the global commodity boom. And it's a different scenario right now. And actually, we're talking about the next year where there is the risk of a global recession, or at least a recession in the European Union, in Russia, in some Latin American countries, and they are all important to Brazil. So it's a much more complicated world. But I think that because of that, many people in the Lula administration, in the Workers' Party, they have the expectation that China is going to help them in many different ways. The biggest challenge perhaps will be how to balance this China that it's a big importer of Brazilian products with the China that is also a rival of the Brazilian industry in a moment where so many people in Brazil are concerned about deindustrialization. And people are asking for protectionism against China. And actually, Lula himself, during his presidential campaign, he spoke about the need of a trade policy that recognizes this threat to the Brazilian industry posed by China. So this is going to be a very difficult debate for him.
Yeah, it's a difficult set of issues to reconcile, as you're pointing out. I'd be curious to know if you end up getting consulted by the incoming administration. Maybe not something you can talk about now, but as a
well, what I can say to you is that I have many friends that are working in the transition team, and we had some informal discussions about China, about foreign policy, but very informal, not something really deep. And I am also working as a consultant for the Brazilian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but in a different scenario. I am part of his editorial committee, and I am helping the ministry to choose what books they will publish, what academic activities they will organize in the next year, this sort of thing. So yes, I am part of the conversation, but a very modest part. And usually people don't follow my advice, so don't blame me for anything that the Brazilian government will do in the next years.
Duly noted. We all heard it here. Yes, I mean, there's a lot there for people to potentially follow up on in further questions regarding deindustrialization and so forth. But before we get to that segment, I did want to ask you one more question then, specifically about kind of the foreign policy of the incoming administration then. So as we know, Lula entering office then soon, but not with a friendly Congress necessarily, certainly without anything approaching a congressional majority. And so it is commonly thought that foreign policy and international relations is a place where he will have more latitude in order to kind of make his mark and pursue an agenda that doesn't involve as much negotiating and consulting with, again, a Congress that is not going to be entirely friendly, presumably. In that regard, I was interested if you could say a bit about what exactly is Lula's view of the world and international affairs. And so you talked a little bit about this kind of shared notion of multipolarity between Brazil and China, potentially. Certainly from a US perspective, there's this common kind of a US governmental perspective, there's a common refrain that that Brazil and other countries in Latin America kind of don't take China seriously enough in terms of its implications for their economic development and the introduction of 5G technology and so forth. Where does Lula fit in this regard? So does he just see China as another power with which there can be this kind of strategic partnership that opens up more space internationally? Does he see China actively as an ally potentially? Is this a scenario where Brazil sees an opportunity, or Lula sees an opportunity to kind of play the US and China off of one another, and by that means create more space for itself? So how would you define that kind of ideological view of the world at this point?
So what happened during the Bolsonaro administration is that the Brazilian president changed the Brazilian foreign policy in a very deep way, and that he broke most of the democratic consensus of the last 40 years. So by the end of the Bolsonaro administration, Brazil was in diplomatic troubles with the United States, with the European Union, with most of Latin America, and with China. It was a very tense administration in terms of foreign policy. And the reason for that trouble was different from each country, right? So for example, the challenge with the United States and with the European Union for Bolsonaro were mostly about the environment and human rights. With China, it was much more this political and ideological approach that he was worried about Chinese influence in Brazil. With Latin America, it became very much the continuation of partisan politics in Brazil. So most of Latin America these days, especially South America, have left-wing presidents, and Bolsonaro had very bad relationship with them. So different reasons, but this common situation of a very complicated foreign policy. And what is happening now with Lula is that international support to him became very important during the campaign and just after his victory. So basically, in the night of the Brazilian election, when the results were announced, and we count votes very quickly in Brazil, it's like a couple of hours, as an electronic system that is really, really effective. But on the same night, we had all the major global leaders say, phoning to Lula, writing to him, and say, congratulations, we are very happy that you are the next president of Brazil. This was something very important for Lula. And this week, Lula is in Egypt, in the COP, in the Conference of the United Nations about climate change, and we received an incredible reception there. I mean, he's not the president, okay? He's the president-elect. He's just going to take office on January the 1st. But he was, in practice, received as the acting president of Brazil. So what can we expect of his foreign policy? First, he's going to pay lots of attention to other global South countries, right? To China, to India, to South Africa. Second, Latin American integration is going to be very important again for Brazilian diplomacy, as it was during the last 40 years. I mean, every president of Brazil paid attention to Latin America in different levels with different agendas, but Latin America is very important to Brazil because it is our neighborhood. And concerning the European Union and the United States, what Lula will try to do is to use democracy, human rights, and the environment as a way to rebuild the ties with Washington, with Paris, with London, with Berlin. It's not going to be an easy relationship. I mean, the United States these days is very concerned about China and Russia in Latin America. But Latin Americans in general are not very worried about that, or not worried at all. I mean, we understand that Russia is an international problem for Europe, for the United States, but it's not a problem for us. On the contrary, Russia is an important trade and economic partner of Brazil. The Brazilian agribusiness sector depends on the imports of Russian fertilizer. So Lula and Bolsonaro disagree about many things, but both of them agree that we should not isolate Russia and that we should reach a peaceful solution to the war in Ukraine. This is going to be very much the line of the Lula administration, and probably Lula will be quite critical of NATO, quite critical of American and European positions on the war on Ukraine. And concerning the United States, Lula wants to build stronger ties with the US, but it's a complicated relationship. And I think that if the American government perceives Chinese influence in Latin America as a zero-sum game, that if China is more powerful, the United States will be less influential, everybody's going to lose. Because Chinese trade and investment are really important to Latin America these days, especially to Brazil, to Chile, to Peru, to South American countries that usually depend much more on the trade with China than Mexico, than Central American or the Caribbean, which are much more dependent on the United States. So yes, there is this new triangle of China, United States, and Latin America, and we're still trying to figure out how it is going to play, how people are going to try to reach some balance. But I would say that at least in the beginning, the new Lula administration will mean good things for the Brazilian traditional diplomatic partners. There is a very sincere feeling in Brazil these days that we need better diplomatic relations, that we became too isolated during the Bolsonaro administration. And the big discussion is, okay, how we're going to rebuild these ties, how we're going to rebuild this confidence concerning the world. But probably it will be about protecting the Amazon, about respecting the environment. But do not expect Brazil to be a very passionate defender abroad of democracy and human rights. This will be very important for us inside Brazil, in our domestic policy. But we are not really going to be a country that is going to support, for example, foreign interventions in defense of democracy, in defense of human rights. We are going to be very cautious about criticizing China, criticize Russia or India because of human rights violations. This is the traditional approach in Brazil to foreign policy, to international affairs.
Great, thank you. Yes, so let's transition to opening up the floor for questions, and I will also encourage you to, if you feel comfortable, please turn your cameras on so that we can make Zoom as friendly and inviting of a space as possible.
And of course, I understand that many people now are very curious about what's happening in Brazil with the elections with Lula. So please feel free to ask me questions about that. I mean, I have been working a lot in the last month, basically trying to explain to foreign audiences what's happening now in my country. So it will be a pleasure to share that with you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for your willingness to engage. Yes, let's go ahead and see what questions people have.
Hi, Maurício. My name is Mateus. I'm an MA in Global Thought here at Columbia. I'm also originally from Rio. So very nice to hear from you and your experience and expertise on Brazil-China relations. Following what you said in terms of Brazil's relationship internationally, either defending human rights or with our approaches in terms of how Russia or China may play a role in the next 4 years of Lula presidency. My question goes about how Lula presented himself throughout 8 years. He had really good relationship with Africa and with African countries, and was able to make many good concessions and promote Brazil as a good partner with the continent. But we also know that China now has vast infrastructure investments in China, in Africa, and is also shifting political perspectives and relationships there. So my question is, do you think Brazil may play a role in terms of how the Belt and Road Initiative will impact politics in Africa? And if so, how would it do that through the Lula administration?
It's a very good question, Mateus. And I think that we should also think a little bit about what's happening with Brazilian relations toward Africa. Brazil's biggest investors in Africa were the big construction companies involved in the car wash operation, right? That they were the target of the major anti-corruption investigations of the last years. And they suffered a huge impact of that. They basically lost the capacity to invest abroad, or at least it's much smaller now than it used to be 10 years ago, both in Africa, in the Middle East, and in Latin America. So Brazil has been a very fragile international actor in Africa in the last years. The Bolsonaro administration actually closed a few Brazilian embassies in Africa. There are many others that do not have an ambassador right now. They're empty. So there's in Egypt, Lula was very much celebrated by the African diplomats and say, okay, you are back. We want to engage with you again. But I think it will be much more about social policy, how the Brazilian social policy can be a reference, an example to similar projects in Africa, and also about this new climate diplomacy that it's becoming much more important in Brazilian foreign policy. And perhaps the biggest difference in the new Lula foreign policy will be climate change. Because in the past, I mean, the Workers' Party is not an ecological party. It's basically on a very traditional left-wing approach to labor relations, trade unions. But in the last years, it became a party much more open to engage in a dialogue with environmental activists, with an agenda of climate change, of climate justice. And I was really impressed in the last weeks by how the rhetoric of Lula changed about these issues. And I have been talking to this new generation of Brazilian activists about climate change because they are usually very young. They're usually on their 20s. And I am really impressed by their qualification, by their commitments, by how they are engaged with the new administration. And I think this will be a very interesting area to watch. Very interesting things will happen in this field. But I do not expect Brazil to be a major player in Africa concerning investment in infrastructure or even an economic agenda in general. I think it will be a much more political engagement with Africa.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. And Augustine, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much, Maurício. It's good to see that you have written this book about the China relations with Brazil. I wanted to hear how you draw a parallel between the kind of relationship that Brazil has with China and the kind of relationship that Brazil has with Kenya in particular, or Africa in general, because much as is not documented, our relationship is since 2013, our government has looked east a lot of relations, but the kind of impact that has been there in the last 10 years is that we have a huge debt. Initially, the Chinese were coming and developing our infrastructure, the new railway, huge roads and everything that they were doing. And people are excited until now. Activists are now trying to complain about the huge debts. So it's not about bringing in development, but is a kind of investing in debt. And we are not exporting as much. So yes, we can see the infrastructure, we can see the development, but also the Chinese also come to do the roads themselves. So the money ends up going back and we are left with debt. But not many are willing to talk that way. They see the benefit. So I don't know how it is happening, whether you would call you as a symbiotic relationship. Thank you.
Thank you, Agustin. It's very good to hear from you, and I miss our conversations. I haven't been able to attend our last meetings because my working schedule is quite hard these days. But yes, it's a very good question. So what's the difference between how Brazil engages with Africa, and Kenya specifically, and with China? When we discuss the Brazilian relations with Africa, they are more horizontal. We're talking about developing countries that are usually more or less at the same level of development, especially when I think about Brazil and South Africa. I think that these days, South Africa is the most important partner that Brazil has in Africa. There is also a very strong cultural link between Brazil and the African countries that were once Portuguese colonies. Angola, Mozambique, Cabo Verde, the same language, it's a very similar history, so we relate in a very strong way with them. But when we discuss the relationship between Brazil and China, it became much more asymmetric these days. And in my book, I interviewed the former foreign minister of Lula, Ambassador Celso Amorim, and Amorim told me a very interesting thing. He told me that 20 years ago, during the global commodity booms, Brazil and China were more or less at the same level, and that he considered China to be another big global South country. But that nowadays, China developed so fast that it reached another level. I mean, it's not a rich country, it's not a global North country, but it's basically acting like a global power, with huge military power, for example, or with the ability to project power abroad. And Amorim told me that he understood now that it was something that it should be taken into account. That the relationship between Brazil and China is not so horizontal right now because China grew so much more than Brazil. And I think that we're going to see that kind of discussion played out in the new Lula administration especially about the concerns that many people have in Brazil about deindustrialization and the role that the competition with Chinese companies play into that. And of course, that there is no such discussion with Africa, right? But I think that the biggest challenge right now in economic terms concerning Brazil and Africa is that Brazil is basically buying just one type of African product, oil and natural gas. So it's basically hydrocarbons. Brazil sells lots of products to China, to Africa. There are many Brazilian companies working in Africa, not just in the oil and gas sector, but also, for example, Brazilian retail shops are engaged in trade with Africa. But there is this challenge: how we're going to build a strong relationship with China, with Africa, without a strong economic basis. So I think that we need to diversify our economic ties. This is going to be a huge challenge, but I think that at least in terms of a political agenda, it will be much stronger now with Lula than it was in the last years, right? And what you discussed about the problem of Chinese debt in Kenya and in other countries, this is a huge discussion going on, including in other Latin American countries, such as Venezuela or Ecuador, but not so much in Brazil. Because here, the way that the Chinese invest in Brazil, it's a much more business-like approach. It's much like any other foreign company doing business in Brazil. So the Brazilian government did not get many loans from China. We don't have a foreign debt problem with China, in contrast to what we are seeing now in many other countries, right? In Kenya, in Sri Lanka, in Pakistan. It is much more like business as usual. So it's a different kind of concern, it's a different kind of relation. I think that the biggest problem in Brazil now concerning Chinese investment is this geopolitical problem that some people in Brazil fear that the Chinese are taking control of key infrastructure in Brazil. And that could be a national security problem.
Very interesting. Thank you. Did you want to say just a little bit about any particular sites of key infrastructure where there are particular concerns?
I can give you two big examples. The biggest Chinese investor in Brazil is the state-owned companies that invest in electrical sector. State Grid and China Three Gorges. And State Grid especially had a couple of very high-profile business deals in the last years. So they bought Companhia Paulista de Força e Luz, which is the main private company in Brazil, which was the main private company in Brazil that distributed electric energy in the state of São Paulo. And São Paulo is the industrial powerhouse in Brazil. So now if you are in São Paulo, you are probably receiving your electrical energy from a Chinese state-owned company. So imagine that in the United States, if New York City received its power from State Grid, or if Boston received its power from State Grid. I think it would be impossible. The Treasury Department would have vetoed it because of concerns of national security. But we don't have that kind of mechanism in Brazil. So if your investment is according to the Brazilian law, okay, you can buy anything that you want. And a second key investment that the Chinese made here was in the Belo Monte Dam in the Amazon, in the Xingu River. The Chinese built the transmission line connecting this big dam in the Amazon with the southeast of Brazil, which is the part of Brazil that really consumes the electric energy that is produced in the Amazon. And the Belo Monte Dam was very controversial in Brazil. I would describe it as the most controversial infrastructure project in Brazil since the return of democracy, because the social and economic and environmental impacts of the dam were huge. It affected lots of indigenous peoples in the Amazon. It is affecting the Xingu River in a harsh way, and it's a very important river. It's one of the rivers that link with the Amazon River. And the Chinese are very much engaged in the dam, connecting it with the rest of the country. So you can see that we're talking about infrastructure projects that have lots of impacts. The Chinese are also very important now to build railways in Brazil. For example, I wrote a paper for the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace about Chinese investment in Brazilian railways in the Amazon. They are basically the most important investors in the railway sector in Brazil right now. And Brazil is a country that has a very fragile railway infrastructure. It depends a lot of ordinary highways. And there is a perception among the Brazilian political leaders that this is a very dangerous situation, that we need to build more railways, especially for export markets, to export soybeans, iron ore, meat. And if we don't get these railways from the Chinese investors, who will do that? Who will invest in this type of infrastructure in Brazil? This is the big dilemma, right?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for those additional details. Other questions? Sophia, go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. This is really interesting, and I think I've learned a lot. I'm especially interested in kind of the social issues within Brazil, and I know that's not as relevant to your talk, but I was wondering if you had anything to say in regards to the presidential election, in terms of the way that Lula dealt with social issues. And I know that I was speaking with one of my professors in the Portuguese department, and he was saying that it's important for Lula to kind of avoid speaking on certain issues and in order to gain election and to win the election, and not touch on any hot topics and risk becoming controversial. And I was wondering if you thought that also had something to do with this economic closeness with China, if that was a consideration, or if you think it's more if it has to do more with the demographics and the public opinion within Brazil, or a little bit of both.
When you say social issues, you're talking about abortion, about sexual and reproductive rights, or about poverty,
yes,
equality?
I think of both. Homosexuality, abortion rights, religion. I think a lot of those things are really interesting pieces of the Brazilian story.
It's true. They were all of them were hot topics during the election, and Lula spoke a lot about fighting poverty, fighting hunger, inequalities in Brazil. I think it was the most important part of his campaign. But he was very cautious about abortion, about sexuality in general. For example, both himself and Bolsonaro said that they are against abortion, that they do not want to expand Brazilian laws about the issue. And concerning religion, Lula has a very serious problem with the evangelicals in Brazil. They were one of the groups that where the support of Bolsonaro was strongest. And evangelicals these days are 1/3 of the Brazilian population, so huge numbers. And Lula made several efforts during his campaign to win the support of the evangelicals, promising them that he will respect their religion, that he will not close their churches, because there was always this kind of fake news going around Brazil saying, oh, if Lula wins the election, he's going to close the churches, he's going to persecute the evangelicals. It became a strong topic during the campaign. But it didn't work. The evangelicals supported Bolsonaro by 2/3 of their votes. So Lula was very careful when discussing this kind of social issue. But at the same time, when you talk about foreign policy, the biggest problem for Lula was not China. It was how the Workers' Party, how the Brazilian left relates to left-wing authoritarian governments in Latin America, in Venezuela, in Cuba, and in Nicaragua. And Bolsonaro talked about Latin America, I think that in every presidential debate in this campaign. And he was always presenting these left-wing governments in the region and not just in Nicaragua, Venezuela, but also in Argentina, as threats to Brazil. He was telling voters that if they elected Lula, Lula was going to turn Brazil into Nicaragua, into Argentina. And so, for example, the issue of religions, religious persecution in Nicaragua became an issue in the Brazilian election. I will give you a very personal example. My favorite uncle is a retired soldier. He served all the Brazilian Navy during all his life. And he's a very peaceful guy, you know, he's very quiet, he loves his animals, he loves his family. But he was asking me in a very concerned way about Nicaragua, about what is happening to Christians in Nicaragua. And I said, Uncle, but where did you hear about that? He said, no, in my WhatsApp groups. I mean, it was something that reached ordinary Brazilians, even people like my uncle that were usually not very much engaged with political debate. But it really became important. And I think it will be a difficult matter for Lula because the Workers' Party is very close to the Sandinistas in Nicaragua. There's a very strong sympathy towards the Chavistas in Venezuela or towards the Cubans. And I don't believe that they will engage in any kind of political action against these governments, against these regimes, and that Lula himself will be very cautious in any type of criticism, public criticism, against Maduro, against Ortega, against Diaz-Canel, but he will be pressured to engage with these governments in a more critical way as well, especially pressure from the United States, but also from the conservative establishment in Brazil. And also, I think that one of the lessons of this last election is that Brazil is a much more divided country today than it was 20 years ago. Brazilian citizens became much more conservative, and the Brazilian political right is much more well organized these days than when Lula was president 10 years, 15 years ago, 20 years ago.
Yes, I mean, it's interesting also to think kind of about the diversity of the contemporary Latin American left in that regard. You have, say, Boric in Chile, who's been very openly critical of governments like the Venezuelan one.
By the statements of Gabriel Boric, but I thought in Brazil, we don't have left-wing leaders that are going to speak like that. It's a very different political left. It's much more traditional.
Yes, other questions? Yes, Laura, go ahead.
Well, I will ask a question just because, first of all, I want to say hi to Maurício and thank you so much. It's so good to see you, and I've missed you as well at our Youth in a Changing World planning committees. But and apologies for coming in late today. I was stuck in another meeting and trying to get here as quickly as I could. And so this is so much of what I know about Brazil is from you and from Kevin. So, but I was really interested in, and since you're so generously talking about the recent elections, there was a headline in the New York Times, I think the day of our election or the day before, about how, you know, what we can learn from Brazil in terms of an orderly transition. And, you know, there was all this fear that luckily did not come to fruition around political violence and just more of the insanity that we've seen in this country since January 6th. And so just wondering if that particular perspective of, you know, look at we're more mature than the Americans. I just was wondering if that was also a kind of a narrative or subtext in Brazil as well.
Well, thank you, Laura. I miss you as well. I miss our conversations during our meetings, but my working schedule has been quite hard in the last months. Well, there were lots of articles about the Brazilian elections in the American press, and I think that some of them were a little bit too enthusiastic about Brazil, right? So what I can say to you is that I think that there is one thing that the Americans can learn from Brazil is our electronic voting system. Our electronic voting system. I think that's something that we do really well in Brazil. How we manage our election, how we count our votes very quickly, I think, yes, this is a benchmark now, I think, to many other countries. But I would be more careful with the discussion about the transition. Our transition is still going on. So far, things have been quite peaceful. But as we are speaking, there are huge numbers of demonstrations going around Brazil of people dressed with the colors of our national flag. They go in front to the military barracks, and they ask the militaries for help because they want a coup d'etat. They say, please save us. We don't want Brazil to be a communist country. And this is going on all over Brazil, right? And I am a little bit worried and scared about that. We're talking about huge numbers of people, thousands and thousands of demonstrators.
Yeah.
Often they are quite educated, college degrees. And they live in this parallel world where Lula is going to implement a communist dictatorship in Brazil. I mean, I can understand some parts of our polarization. I can understand why people are so angry with Lula because of the corruption and people that are never going to vote for him because of that. Okay, this is rational. But this anti-communist agenda in Brazil, it doesn't make sense. But this fear that the evangelicals are going to be persecuted, that the churches are going to be closed, that doesn't make sense here. But it became an important part of what people believe.
Yeah.
And I see that in my family as well. I mean, it's not just something that I read about in the newspapers. It became something very
I mean,
part
all
of our
our
daily
families
lives.
too.
Yeah.
It's craziness.
True.
So what's to be done? I mean, I think.
Well, I think that we need to think about a very big research about disinformation, about these new types of political propaganda, and how that affects hearts and minds of many people. And I think not just in Brazil, I think probably in the United States, there are many people with the same type of behavior, or in countries such as India or Eastern Europe. I mean, this is a global phenomenon.
Yeah.
But my point is that we are living in a different world than 5 years ago in Brazil, when many people, including myself, believed that the political information that counted was the one that we read about in the press or the one that we saw on television, on the more formal and traditional media outlets. And this is not true anymore. There is this new ecosystem of information going around WhatsApp, Telegram, YouTube, on the internet in general. And this is affecting the way that people choose their candidates, the way that they vote.
Yeah. Thank
Yeah,
you.
and maybe as a closing question in that regard, obviously Lula has yet to assume the presidency, but looking ahead as we find ourselves having to do, what do you foresee? Sorry to ask a prediction question, but what do you foresee in a few years heading down the line toward another presidential election? So the potential return of Bolsonaro to run again, Lula could potentially run again, right, for a second term. I don't know if much has been said about that, and if not, then who is the heir apparent? Is it the incoming vice president? Is it Bolos? Is it someone else?
Well, we're talking about how the American media was covering the Brazilian elections, right? And there were a few pieces on American media that were more or less like, Lula's election saved the world. And I say, guys, come on, it's not that much, okay? It's going to be a very difficult administration. I think a much more difficult government than when Lula was elected president for the first time 20 years ago. Why? Brazil is a much more polarized and divided society nowadays. Polarized in terms of social class, in terms of religion, in terms of the different regions of the country. I mean, the middle class, the upper class, they're basically very much against Lula right now. So how that's going to be played out in terms of political stability in the country, it's going to be pretty hard. Lula was president during the global commodity boom, when everything was going very well for Brazil. It's a completely different scenario right now. We have the war, the pandemic, Europe facing the threat of a recession. The American economy is not going very well. The Chinese economy is not well either. So we're talking about Brazil, more important economic partners. This is going to reflect on us. And Lula is having trouble with his new economic team. We are still waiting to see who is going to be the new minister, what they're going to do. But there is already tension between Lula and the financial markets, mostly because of a debate about government spending. Because Lula wants to boost government spending to fight poverty, to fight inequality. And there are many people in Brazil, in the business community, the financial market, concerned that that would lead to a very high level of inflation. So there's already this big tension going on. If you look to the Brazilian stock exchange or to the exchange rate of the real, they are not good in the last couple of weeks. We can see the reflection of these concerns. And if we look to other Latin American countries that elected left-wing presidents in the last months, Chile, Colombia, they are facing the same kind of problem. So there are these huge social demands because of the pandemics, because of an increase in poverty in the last years. So people are expecting more from the state in terms of response to the social emergency. But at the same time, the economic situation is so much more difficult now that it constrains the ability of the state to deliver, to fulfill these promises. So I think that probably there are going to be lots of people who are disappointed with Lula in the next years, because it will be hard for him to balance all these pressures, all these demands. It's not going to be an easy administration. And in terms of the rising stars in the Brazilian political scene, Lula has already said that he's not going to run for president anymore. I mean, he's almost 80, okay? So yes, the guy needs to rest a little bit, right? We have a new generation of leaders in the left. For example, Fernando Haddad, that's probably going to be a minister in the Lula administration, probably going to be in his cabinet. He's a rising star in the Workers' Party. In the center-right, we have Simone Tebet. She was the third place in the election. She is an agribusiness leader from the Brazilian Midwest, but she's assuming more progressive positions in terms of social policy. She's a very strong name to run for president in the next election. She's somebody that you should all pay attention in. And in the conservative group, everything is about Bolsonaro these days. More or less like in the Republican Party these days, everything is about Trump, right? So Bolsonaro has many sons, and even if he cannot run for president, some of his sons can do that. So we have to look about what the Bolsonaro family will do in the next years, how they are going to react to the Lula administration. But Bolsonaro received 49% of the vote. He is very strong politically, right? And he will be, of course, the leader of the opposition, although there is a big possibility that Bolsonaro will end in jail, because he's now, I think he faces now 56 charges of corruption, if I'm not wrong. But there are lots of judicial charges against him, and at least one of them may end in jail.
What I'm hearing from you is that we're going to have to invite you back to help us to keep understanding this complex situation. It
will be a pleasure, because I mean, it will really be my daily work in the next years.
We'll go to one last question from Maria before we depart.
Yes, I do have a question. I'm so sorry. I don't know why I cannot turn my camera on, but thank you so much for coming. This was so interesting. I'm a senior at Columbia College. I'm originally from Rio. I'm a senior at Columbia College studying political science, and I'm actually writing a paper about the trade relations between China and Brazil. And I was
that's
very
great.
Yes, and I was very interested in the conversation. What your point about, what does it mean for an emerging economy to pick a side in the 21st century, like globalized world that we have? So I don't know if you want to discuss a little bit more about how China and the US use Latin America as an arena for their own conflicts, and that prevents like emerging markets to establish their own national like interests in the economy of the 21st century. So if you could talk a little bit more about that and about, I don't know, trade, or recommend some books, or I would really appreciate it, because
Sure.
it was very interesting. Thank you so much.
Maria, I think that I can send you my email. We can go on with this conversation. I can recommend you a few papers about the subject. But I would say that there are two institutions that you should watch in Brazil about Brazilian and Chinese trade. One is the Brazilian Chinese Business Council, Conselho Empresarial Brasil-China, and the other one is the Brazilian Center for International Relations, SEBRE. And both institutions have been publishing lots of policy papers and analysis about what's going on in economic terms between Brazil and China. So I think that the biggest problem in the near future will be the protectionism of the Brazilian industry, especially in sectors such as textiles, toys, apparels, where Chinese competition is really hard against the Brazilians. And they are going to ask the support of Lula. And one of the things that Lula promised in the campaign was to recreate the Ministry of Industry and Foreign Trade, where I worked in the past. And the Ministry of Industry, it's basically a big place where industrial leaders can go and ask the Brazilian government for help. So when I was working as an aide to the Brazilian Secretary of Foreign Trade, he used to compare his office to the line outside a public hospital. Because everybody was going there to complain about the pain, about a broken limb, and asking for his help. And I think this is going to happen a lot. And probably the Brazilian government under Lula will try to reach some kind of agreement with China to restrict exports to Brazil in sensitive areas. They did that in the past, in textiles, for example. And I think that Xi Jinping realizes now that Brazil is so important to him as a political actor, as somebody that he can talk to in the middle of all these conflicts with the West, that probably he will be willing to concede at least a little bit in terms of economic relations to gain the political support of Brazil. And in terms of this triangle between Brazil, China, and the United States, or Brazil, Russia, and the United States, because the Americans and Europeans are talking about Russia and Latin America all the time as well. Brazil is a very big country. And I think that there is not any other state that can tell to Brazil, oh, you should not trade with China, you should not trade with Russia, or you should impose sanctions, you should impose restrictions. That may work with small countries, but not with Brazil. And Brazil foreign trade is quite diverse in terms of its partners. So Brazil sells a lot to Asia, but also sells a lot to Latin America, to the United States, the European Union. And Brazilians want to keep that way. They want a very balanced trade with the rest of the world. We still don't know who is going to be the next Minister of Foreign Affairs under Lula, but we know that Ambassador Celso Amorim is going to be very important, if not as somebody who is going to hold office during the Lula administration, as a kind of political mentor, as a kind of political guide to what's going on. And Amorim gave an important interview to the Quincy Institute a few days ago, where he was saying that Brazil will pursue a diplomacy of non-alignment between Brazil, the United States, and China. That Brazil wants to keep good relations with Washington and with Beijing. And I think this will be very much the tone of the Lula administration. The Brazilian government understands that it needs the support of its traditional partners, And at the same time, the major international crises, such as the war in Ukraine or the conflict in Taiwan, they are very far away from the reality of the majority of Brazilians. What we want to do is to go on with trade, to go on with investment, and not be on the crossfire between the great powers.
Thank you so much, Mauricio, for your time and sharing your insights, and to everybody else for being with us and for your thoughtful questions. It was a very interesting and thought-provoking conversation. I will just reiterate that Mauricio's book, available through the Columbia Library digitally, is entitled Brazil-China Relations in the 21st Century, The Making of a Strategic Partnership, and I very much encourage you to check it out. So
I'm going to
yes.
write my email on the chat, so if people want to go on with this conversation, please feel free to write to me, and we can exchange some ideas and tips about Brazil. And by the way, I was telling Kevin that there is it's a very hot topic now in Brazil if we are going to support or not the Brazilian national team during the World Cup.
This was my question before we started.
I am supporting Brazil. I have my problems with Neymar, but I am willing to forget that during the World Cup.
There you have it.
Very interesting World Cup. The first time in the Arab country, the first time in the Middle East, right?
And no beer.
And no beer. No,
That
this is
hit the
possible.
headlines yesterday. No beer.
And two Latin American frontrunners. So we'll see how that plays out as well. Thank you for your time. I appreciate you sharing your contact information. There is a question in the chat about accessing the book from afar.
Send me an email and we can solve that problem.
Very, very good. Thank you so much for your time and for joining us. We look forward to seeing you at future events, which we will have in the spring semester, and a nice weekend to all. Thank you, Mauricio.
Okay,
Thank you again, Mauricio.
Always a pleasure to be here at Columbia and to see again my friends. I have been missing our meetings. But then again, thank you. It was really good for me. And if you need anything, just write to me.
Thank you so much. Take care.
Thank you, everyone.